Salawat. We're now going to start the program, the recitation of Quran. Nabila.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والفجر وليال عشر والشفع والوتر والليل إذا يسر هل في ذلك قسم لذي حجر ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بعاد إرم ذات العماد التي لم يخلق مثلها في البلاد وثمود الذين جابوا الصخر بالواد وفرعون ذي الأوتاد الذين طغوا في البلاد فأكثروا فيها الفساد فسب عليهم ربك صوت عذاب إن ربك لبالمرصاد فأما الإنسان إذا ما ابتلاه ربه فأكرمه ونعمه فيقول ربي أكرمن وأما إذا ما ابتلاه فقدر عليه رزقه فيقول ربي أهانن كلا بل لا تكرمون التي ولا تحاذون على طعام المسكين وتأكلون التراث أكلا لما وتحبون المال حبا جما كلا إذا دكت الأرض دكا دكا وجاء ربك والملك صفا صفا وجيء يومئذ بجهنم يومئذ يتذكر الإنسان وأنى له الذكرى يقول يا ليتني قدمت لحياتي فيومئذ لا يعذب عذابه أحد ولا يوثق وثاقه أحد يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي صدق الله العظيم.
Today we're very fortunate to have two brilliant guests today, David Tuck and Varsha Dodhia, who will be speaking to us on fasting across faiths. Let's welcome them with salawat and a round of applause. Muslim. Why not? David Tuck is well known to many of us. He's come to the centre on a number of different occasions for many different years, and we've worked with him across a range of different activities over the last decade or longer. He's a priest and has been in parish ministry for most of his working life, and he's been able to continue that since his retirement in 2001. He's actively participated in various events here, and we're very pleased to welcome him once again. Varsha Dodhia is a project manager with experience of working in a program management office, and she's the co-chair of the CNWL Black Asian MN Ethnic Staff Network, and Today they're speaking on the topic of fasting across faiths. Please, let's start. David.
Thank you. We're thinking tonight about fasting and faith. But let's first remember that going without food, and sometimes drink as well, it can be very important in other places and settings too. For instance, going without food, fasting can have very good effects, so they say, on our health. And do you remember, as I do, that pre-op letter that nearly always comes with a notice about a surgical procedure? No food for 12 hours before you come to the hospital for your operation. And then, of course, there are political considerations as well. Remember Gandhi, who undertook several very long fasts, which were political and social protests. They had a very big impact on the future of the British Raj in India and on the Indian population in general. And in Northern Ireland, in 1981, during the Troubles, that prisoner, Bobby Sands, do you remember, was part of the 1981 hunger strike. He was protesting for better rights for prisoners, and he died after 68 days of fasting. that was a real hunger strike. 100,000 people went to his funeral, and that hunger strike only ended after another 9 people died of fasting. And finally, let's not forget that tonight there are millions of people around the world who are without food. They are not fasting, they're starving. But it's fasting in the context of Christianity that I've been asked to speak about for a few minutes this evening. Thank you for the invitation. It's always lovely to be here with friends on a Friday evening. Thank you again. There's a great deal about fasting in the Bible, both in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, and in the New, especially in the teaching of Jesus himself. However, there's very little evidence that fasting had any serious place in the corporate life of the early Christian communities, at least for the first 200 years. But from then on, fasting became increasingly important in the life of the churches. But the severity and the frequency did ease up towards the end of the Middle Ages. Today, fasting remains important in the lives of the Eastern Orthodox churches, but in the Western churches, it's no longer a prominent feature. In the early days of Israel, total abstinence was often the expression of very deep, profound emotions. The very last words of the first book of Samuel tell us that after King Saul and his 3 sons had taken their own lives after defeat in battle, his followers cremated the remains and fasted for 7 days. The book of 1 Samuel ends with these words: "They took their bones and buried them under the tamask tree in Jabesh and fasted for 7 days." Fasting was common. King Jehoshaphat was afraid. He set himself to seek the Lord and proclaimed a fast throughout the whole country. And there are many other examples in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Perhaps the most powerful words on fasting that still echo to us down the ages are in the book of the prophet Isaiah. Fasting, he said, can just be no more than an empty gesture, going without food for its own sake. Look, he says, you serve your own purposes only if you fast simply as a formality and for show. Fasting like this is not pleasing to God. He says, is fasting to bow down the head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the fast that I choose? To loosen the bonds of injustice, to let the oppressed go free? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and to bring the homeless poor into your own house? Let's move on to the story of Jesus. In the early stages of that story, the follower of his cousin, John the Baptist, he recently baptized Jesus, expressed their horror that while they were fasting, Jesus' followers weren't, and seemed almost to be having just a good time. But there is a lot more to be said about Jesus and fasting. He began his 3 years of teaching, preaching, and healing with an extended, almost 6-week period of withdrawal into the desert. The Gospels tell us that he ate no food during that time, a very lengthy fast. It almost certainly had the result of putting him into a trance-like state during which he confronted and defeated powerful temptations to pursue an easy path to power. Lent is the Christian 40 days of preparation for Holy Week and Easter. And it's modelled on those 40 days in the wilderness. By the way, today for us is day 17 of Lent, still 27 to go. In another fasting reference in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus warns against mixing fasting with being miserable. When you fast, said Jesus, don't be dismal, in St. Matthew's Gospel. Of course, masochism has all too often been a feature of Christian piety, making yourself miserable, unhappy, hurt, will be pleasing to God. What rubbish. George Bernard Shaw, the writer, exchanged letters over several years with a nun. She wrote in a letter to Shaw to say, I hate Christmas. I hate Easter. They're not for me, she said. They're just a distraction. I want to spend my whole life thinking about Jesus' suffering and death. That surely was a sign of a very disturbed mind, a distortion of true religious belief, and she wasn't the only one. I think it's important to say here that we Christians don't have quite the clarity in our sacred scriptures in the Bible on fasting, in the teaching of Jesus, that Islam has in the teaching of the Prophet in the Quran. On the one hand, Jesus himself fasts for 40 days in the wilderness. On the other hand, in St. Luke's Gospel, Jesus is asked, why do John's disciples frequently fast and pray, but your disciples eat and drink? Jesus replied, you cannot make the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them, can you? We know nothing about fasting in the earliest Christian centuries, but the church soon made up for that. By the time of the Norman conquest, 1,000 years ago here, in the 11th century, fasting had become a very important and quite universal part of Christian practice. The days leading up to Christmas and Easter, Advent and Lent were all fast days, as were all Fridays, and at one time even Wednesdays as well. The rules varied, but they always meant no meat and no dairy products either. The rules for the religious orders, for monks and nuns, were much stricter, and especially for some orders like the Cistercians, the Carthusians and the Carmelites. But for everyone it was fish on Friday. We hear an echo of that old rule, I think even today, in our secular world. In the world I move in, lots of non-church people will say, oh, Friday, fish on Friday. Yeah, oh, right, that's interesting. Oh, really? Yeah. However, if the rules were very strict at the start of the Middle Ages, 5 centuries later, they'd been significantly relaxed. I discovered some remarkable evidence for this last year on holiday when visiting the ruins of Jervo Abbey in North Yorkshire. Although this community diminished in numbers, they were Cistercians. They got fewer and fewer members over the years. The kitchens got bigger and bigger. Well, what about today? Well, here, certainly, fasting is not now a prominent feature in the life of the churches in the West, certainly not my own. The rule that you must fast all night before receiving the bread and wine of the Eucharist or Holy Communion was strictly kept in both Catholic and many Anglican churches. But I don't think it had any place in the free churches like the Methodists and the Baptists. I could be wrong here. It was certainly in place when I was a boy, And I remember worrying terribly that the little biscuit I ate before going to church one Sunday morning made me a very, very serious sinner. In the Church of England, we seem to have abandoned pre-communion fasting altogether. The Catholics reduced it, first to 3 hours, and then in 1976 to 1 hour. Thank goodness, those rigid rules have gone. But we are in danger, I think, of losing something very precious. Fasting with no purpose, except to make sure we don't break the rules or to impress other peoples, is worthless, as Isaiah said so many centuries ago. Is this acceptable to God? No. But for Christians now, in Lent especially, fasting and more widely giving up something for a period of time can be very special. This can draw us closer to God and, I believe, closer to each other. Giving something up can have plenty going for it. In Lent, it heightens our anticipation of the great feast of Easter. We've got no flowers in church at the moment during Lent. That's not fasting, but it is abstinence. They are all the more glorious when they reappear on Easter Sunday. The money we save from what we may have given up can make resources available for those in need. And above all, surely, Lent helps us to remember that it's God who is the source of our life, not material things, not the 10,000 choices on our local supermarket shelves. I'm trying this Lent, probably not hard enough, but I am trying. I think Rumi, the great Sufi mystic, sums up the value of fasting, both for Christians and for Muslims. There's a hidden sweetness in the stomach's emptiness, he says. We are lutes, no more, no less. If the sound box is stuffed full, there's no room for music. If the brain and the belly are burning clean with fasting, every moment a new song comes out of the fire. The fog clears, new energy makes you run up the steps before you. When you fast, good habits gather like friends who wish to help. Don't give it to some illusion and lose your power. But even if you have, if you've lost all will and control, they do come back when you fast, like soldiers appearing out of the ground, pennants flying above them. A table descends to your tents, Jesus' table. Expect to see when you fast this table spread with other food, better than the broth of cabbages. Thank you.
So David, you can really articulate fasting in very many different perspectives. I'm just a lay Jain. I don't have scriptural knowledge to that extent. Hopefully what I say gives a flavor of how in our daily lives we practice the concept of fasting. So I'll start with that we are going to have Ramadan, and it is a festival of Ramadan. So within us Jains, we have a festival we call Paryushan, and it follows the lunar calendar. So usually falls August or September, and this year it will be in September. So Paryushan has a special meaning. It is preparing yourself for the special day. So the 8th day is the preparation time, and then the last day is the day of forgiveness. So it falls every year, a calendar day, which is day of forgiveness. And literally we have to go and ask everyone, will you please forgive me? We call it Michami Dukram. And there is a special prayer which is about 3 hours long that you do annually, which is actually forgiving while walking, working, carrying on your daily chores. You may have trodden on ants, you may have moved water bodies, you may have cut plants. So it's not just human beings, but everything that is alive. So part of the Paryushan is that. And the 8-day fast, some people say it's like a bonfire of pains. So the fast, if you do a proper fast, is no food, only possibly a glass of warm water a day. But it kind of really is way to discipline yourself. Because one thing is that to forgive is something you have to work internally. And the whole idea of fasting for us is the internal transformation. So all the fast within the Jain faith is actually working on yourself, not for others. But this is a particular festival. And when it's a festival, everybody's doing it together. So you can imagine 3 members in a family fasting together. But it would be on the last day and then the 9th day when you break the fast. And like I see all the children here. So when you break the fast, you are given something very special. And even the little kids say, all right, I'm going to help you break your fast with a little spoon. So it becomes like a family event. Friends are invited. And that is where we say it becomes like a festival for Paryushan. So what's really the central piece of our belief system? Because unlike Christianity and Islam and Judaism, we don't have a single God. So the Jains are very close to what the Buddhists believe, that there is an internal soul, and then you come into life after death. So you're moving into a cycle of birth and death. And the whole purpose of a human birth is to elevate yourself to go towards nirvana. So you break that cycle of birth and death. And to come closer to your true self is something you need to aspire to. And fasting is one of those ways of really getting closer to yourself. So within the Jain religion, the central tenet is non-violence. So, it's like if I'm going to fast and then really be angry with somebody, that just is not something that's acceptable for us. So, as a Jain, they say, but how do you really practice? And the part of it is preparing yourself for self-discipline and restraint. And I know, Jains get forgotten. I mean, we are a very small community worldwide now. And because we've never ever fought wars, there isn't a victor. But a Jina is actually somebody who's the victor within their inner self. That they have such a disciplined life, a disciplined aura, that they are like a true leader. So it's one thing, living a very pious life is around real discipline. So as a Jain, those who are really practicing every day, they would not eat anything after sunset. Because, in olden times, there were no lights or whatever. You don't know what has fallen into your food or plate. So the idea was to have your last meal before the sunset, and then you don't eat anything until the next day. So now these days, people say if you don't eat for 12 hours or 18 hours, that was kind of built in to our way of fasting. So it's like not to eat anything after sunset and then before in the morning. Usually you go to the temple, do your prayers, and by the time you come home, it's about 7 or 8 in the morning. So it's like you've had that level of fast. The other part is 5 days in a month. So, along the lunar calendar, the 2 8 days, the 14th and 1 5 is days when a lot of people would do 1 meal a day. So we call it an ekasram. So the whole idea is that you Usually people have it at lunchtime, and it's on one sitting. So whatever you can have, you also make your cup of tea, whatever you want. You just sit down and have one meal, and then nothing until the next morning. So again, if you do that 5 days, the intermittent fasting, in terms of lower calories for that day, come into the force. Some people say, oh, I can't do one. You can do 2 meals. But again, if you do 2 meals, do the next one before sunset, or 10 o'clock and possibly 6 o'clock. So it's like ekasunu, meaning 1 meal, byasunu, meaning 2 meals. And a lot of people practice this in their normal routine. So I know my mother did, that generation who kind of really followed a very strict calendar. Some people, because they have medication or something, they say, I can't fast for so long. They would say, okay, on these days, I will not eat anything green. So again, it's part of a restraint, but say, okay, anything that's leaf, so you'll have a chapati, lentil, anything that's made dry, but not green vegetables on those days. So part of it is restraint. Boiled water, again, one part of it was purifying the water. So the idea was that when you are fasting, you shouldn't drink water from the river or whatever. It may have certain other things. So you should have just warmed boiled water. So it's a kind of a practice in our daily lives. And if I go back to Mahavira, so Mahavira is a historical figure. He's one of our 24th Tirthankaras. And so this kind of, we have an iconographic picture of him. And he would have been either a little earlier than Buddha. So the philosophy that both these faith leaders had was quite similar around, shamanic, so tradition, not the Vedic tradition, but the shamanic, where you believe in the soul, and the whole idea of birth is to elevate yourself to a higher being. And we have 23 Tirthankaras before Mahavira. So, according to our tradition, our religion is much, much older. But Mahavira was kind of quite strict in the way he taught. And Buddha followed a middle path. So even though the two philosophies are quite similar, they've deviated a bit. And Mahavira kind of went into the forest. So being born a king, he had all the privileges in a palace. And then the idea was giving up everything and walking away from your privileges. So what I saw with the Christian tradition was, when I went to Assisi and I saw the life of St. Francis, of being born in a very wealthy family and then saying, no, my route is in a different way. It's that kind of thing, that you leave your worldly goods and then walk the path of a mendicant. And with the walking through the path of mendicant, it is like you go into single isolation. So he lived in a forest until he got salvation. And what you talked about, that when you detach yourself from the family, the worldly life, you have very little food, you fast, that's when the inner aspect of your soul shines through. And this is what we are taught, that part of the fasting is actually for you to get closer to yourself. And in some ways, what is encouraged is do as much as you can. So, for our sons and them, what we would say, okay, we know it's Paryushan. Can you do a digital detox? Put your phone away. For them, restraining, not having their smartphone with them is a big thing. Or you say, okay, I will not watch television for a time. But it's that principle of giving up something that you are just so used to, and that is called a fast. Of restraint is called a fast. So your digital detox is actually a fast. And within the religion, it says poshada. So the Poshada is actually retreating from your worldly life. So as a lay person, you can live like a monk or a nun for a number of days. And that's giving up. So you move away from your family home into a monastic order for a short time, and you live the life of a monk or a nun, and you come back. The monks and nuns have very strict guidelines on what they can eat, when they can eat, how. So the Jain monks and nuns live like a sangha, where there's a community of Jains, they live in the sangha. And if, for example, if I offer my house as accommodation for them, then they would not take any food from the house. And the whole idea for them is to take very little food from 15 or 20 households, and they go with a bowl, and it's put into their bowl. So they need to live within the community without being a burden to the community. And that's how the monks and nuns have lived. And one of the reasons was they would always walk in bare feet. And that's why across the Western world, we've not had many Jain monks and nuns, except for one reformed movement. One of the acharyas, who is a Jain, he said, now our diaspora are going across the globe. They are no longer in India. How do we give ministry to them? So I don't know if you lived in Harrow, sometimes you see two ladies. There will always be two in very white clothes with a head covered. And one of them was doing a PhD at School of Oriental and African Studies in comparative religion. So, and recently this community have bought a house in Pinner. So it's called Jain Vishwa Bharti, and they have a center now. But traditionally, in India, they would walk everywhere, but they would not cross the ocean or go in a vehicle or go on a plane. But these monks and nuns, when they are invested into the order, they don't take all the vows. So they don't take the vow that I will not eat something which is not prepared for me. So imagine if you're in Italy, people are going to prepare food which you can take. It's specially made for you. So if you were a full nun, you would not be able to do that. They wear shoes, and they use electronic devices, electricity, because you can't do your research or computer work or anything without that. So in Jainism, the monks and nuns have very austere life. They would never eat anything after sunset, wake up very early with their prayers, like the monastery, where the routine for the monks and nuns is set. But as lay people, so I'm a lay Jain, there is a variation. And somehow, as I said, we lose this piece about fasting. So because we are not in touch with monks and nuns who, kind of give their sermons and that, we've moved quite a lot away. So I, for one, if I told what my monk or nun, what I do, they said, no, you've really moved away from the Jain way of life, because I would be having meals after the sunset. I will not be following the full dietary requirements or not fulfilling the fast as per Jain tradition. But what we now think about, and the way we think about it, is we live in a very fast world, and sometimes these sessions that come, so for like Ramadan for you, Paryushan for us, it's a time to slow down. We take that time to slow down. Take that time to do reflection. Take the time to study. And take time to listen to what the preachers, they say. So our tradition is you do the fasting, but we don't have a break the fast in the evening. It's only one day. So after the 8 days in Paryushan, when we have the fasting, then the whole community come together for one meal. So if we do the meal at the Potter's Bar Jain Temple, there would be about 3,000 people, 5,000 people who would come together for that meal, because our centers are much small, but people would make an attempt to come to that. There is a number of other fasts which are done for those who are really, really pious. So one of them is called a Varsha. So Varsha is like, it has a structure to it, and it's over 1 year. So some people, once they become spiritually elevated, they've done a number of fasts, they will come and do this 1 year fast. So with this 1 year, it is 1 day fast, the second day you have one meal, and then some days you have 2 meals, and then a fast again. So this follows a whole pattern for a year, and then you break the big fast with a big celebration. So I know quite a few ladies, once kind of your grandmothers or whatever, you finished with your household duties, then you say, okay, this is something I would like to embark on, but it comes a lot later in life for a lot of people. Okay. The other one is, we also have something called Ambel. Now, during the year, there are various times during the calendar where certain small festivals come about. And this Ambel festival is when you don't eat the greens, and the diet is very little salt and very small meals, and maybe once a day or whatever. And it's done in a communal way, but again, very small numbers. So people will follow different levels of fasting, but it's really encouraged that we do the fasting in the way we live, by restraining ourselves and making sure that part of it is actually going inwards, going more disciplined. And I'll just finish, I haven't got as big, with something that was said by the poet Coleridge. He prayeth best, who loved best, all things both great and small, for the dear God who lived us, he made and loved us. And in a similar way, the prayer that Bhagwan Mahavir, a prayer which speaks with the voice of non-violence, is, let there be happiness for all. And this is the central thing, that by doing our fasting, we're actually giving liberation to ourselves and people around us. So let there be happiness for all. Let there be spirituality, because part of the fasting is elevating the spirituality within ourselves. Let all perceive and what is good. So it's like seeing what is good and not going away from negativity. And there be no pain or suffering. So part of our concept of fasting is going away from pain and suffering, because we are now working within ourselves to take the negativity out. So that is why types of fasting are encouraged in Jainism. It's part of discipline and part of getting closer to our internal soul. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. If there are any questions from either side.
David, thank you for the talk. I was very intrigued when you said about the fish eating on a Friday. Oh, yes. Although people are not many Christians here, it's very well known proverb to say let's eat fish on a Friday. When I was to work, they always just say let's have fish and chips. No other day but Friday was a big day for fish and chips. And we all used to joke and say, my God, this Jesus did so good. All the fish and chips are making money on that one day. So I just want to ask, you might have said it, maybe I didn't hear you properly. What, did Christ say to eat fish and chips? Where did it actually come from? If you can just elaborate a little bit, please. I'm just intrigued by that, because at work we used to do this all the time,
I don't think I can. Huh? I can't think of any saying of Jesus about eating fish on Fridays.
So where did it come from?
No, but certainly you're right. It was a Christian custom. It's filtered down into our secular society, and most people have got no idea where it comes from. Oh. Of course, one of the features in the Middle Ages in the monasteries and the convents was there were beautiful fish ponds where fish were bred and they're still there in large numbers. But I don't know where the authority for fish on Fridays comes from. Does anybody? Yes, Richard.
I apologise for being in the wrong part of the room, but yes, my grandfather actually ran a fish and chip shop, and my mother, whose father, this particular grandfather, was, always used to tell me that the practice of eating fish on a Friday related to Good Friday, and it was a mark to recall that that was the day that Jesus died, and it was not appropriate to eat animal flesh on that day. That may or may not be the definitive origin of it, but that is what I had always understood, that it did relate to a remembrance of Christ's death on the cross.
The Greek word for fish, ichthus, is made up of the Greek letters which stand for Jesus Christ, universal Saviour of the world. Now, whether there's any connection there, I don't know. Friday it's obviously why it's Friday, but it's the fish that's a mystery.
Thank you, Varsha. So, one of the issues we are facing here is the varying length of the day and night, winter and summer. So do you find that a problem in the fasting in the summer, for example? Well, you'll be okay because sunset will be like 9:30 or 10. But in the winter, if it is 4:30, then maybe challenging. It is not something which is we know from India or wherever else.
So for us, the lunar calendar and where the religion started and why in that particular lunar calendar month. So I did ask, why does it always fall at that time? And the explanation given to us was we have a winter, a rainy season in India. So when it's the rainy season, the monks and nuns don't travel. They settle in one place. And that is a time this festival of 8-day Paryushan is. So that, and it's a time also because the fields are having the rain, people are not working in the fields so much. So it's we call it a chomasu, or in our Gujarati word, and that's why within the agricultural calendar it falls in that month. So unlike what you have, except that sometimes if you have a lunar calendar, you get a leap month. So then it fluctuates, just like Easter. That it would be sometimes middle of August, and other times towards the tail of September. So the religion was in a particular geographical area, and which had a particular pattern of harvest, farming, and now we live in a very different area. So yes, I understand that keeping to that strict is much more difficult. And here, by 4 o'clock, if you've had a meal, and the next day the sun rises after 8, it becomes a very long evening as well. Yes.
We also had some Hindu friends back in Uganda. Some of the ladies used to say that we can only eat if the sun comes out. If it is a cloudy day, we cannot eat. Is there anything you know that?
Not in the Jain tradition, but it's so in the Hindu tradition, some people say like Surya Namaskar. Okay, so there is the Surya Namaskar is actually a practice of yoga, and you do it in the morning. So when the sun rises, the rays of the sun are supposed to be very energizing. And in the yogic tradition, there's a movement that you do, and people do it 8 times or whatever. So the whole idea is in a Hindu household, you have a tulsi, a basil in the front of the house, and the women always make sure that they go around that tulsi 3 times and do a lamp and do the Surya Namaskar before they come into the kitchen. So there are practices, I mean, it may not be universal, but there are practices because, again, like Hindu traditions. So because we live on the same land, some of the cultural elements of Hindus and Jains are very common. The explanations are very common. So, it's like culturally we are same, from a religious perspective, some slightly different.
Can I ask if it's true that Gandhi the Mahatma, he had Jains in his family? A Jain grandmother or grandfather? Is that right?
So in Gujarat, so he was born in
Gujarat,
in Porbandar, which is a port, and around that. So this is the fascination between Jains and Hindus. In one family, the mother could be a Jain, the father could be a Vaishnava, and they would coexist quite comfortably. Gandhi, he studied and he came to UK to become a barrister. And at that time, the clothes he used to wear, whatever he did was very much with a Western mindset. And after his qualification, he worked in South Africa. Yes. And it is in South Africa that he started, the apartheid kind of really brought to him this inequality, and he felt there wasn't justice. So some of his early experiments, because he would say, okay, why is this happening? He would gather the Indians together. He had a small, a community there. But some of his early trials is thinking about it. And when he traveled to India, he came in connection with Srimad Rajchandra, who was kind of quite a learned soul. And he had a lot of questions saying, look, if I look at Christianity, then the Bible says this. I've also studied the Quran, and it says this. What do you think would be the right religion? And Srimad said, okay, go back to what is your holy book, and you'll find the answers in your holy book.
But he did have a Jain grandmother, is that right?
I don't know exactly, but what I'm saying is in those families, I'm from a Gujarati tradition, it is possibility that within that extended family structure, there would be a Jain lady within the Vaishnava family, because the intermarriages did happen. So we had Dr. L.M. Singhvi, who was the High Commissioner for India, and he said that his mother was Jain, but his father was Hindu, and how he adopted the Jain tradition much later in life, because sometimes you take a patriarchal line towards what your religion is, and then when you come into contact and start thinking about it and what your mother has taught you, then you come to a different thinking. So in India, it still exists, that you would have both of them side by side. People have lived close to one another, and it's not been a problem. The only thing I feel in India, traditionally, a lot of the Jains were like finance ministers, or they ran businesses. Even in olden times, we can talk about 2,000 years ago, there would be merchants who would do textiles from Ahmedabad, and they would go into Middle East. Even in Roman times, the cloth from India used to be available for the togas in Rome. So the trade that happened. And even today, the Jain community in India and abroad, we are quite a wealthy community. And the Jain temples, because of that mercantile or business, if you go into India, a lot of the Jain temples are really good marble architecture, quite large temples, similar to one in Neasden. That's the kind of architecture we have. Even though we are a very small community, the footprint of the religion in Abu, Ranakpur, Shatrujay, it's quite large. So even though the numbers are small, the traditions are lived across India, and I guess even abroad.
Just a quick question, David. You mentioned possibly in passing, but about how you, before the communion there's a few hours of fasting, historically there were, and that became less. And I think you used the term less rigid. And I think there was, I think, a positive association with it being less rigid. When you think about, and I fully understand how rigidity sometimes can have challenges when it comes to faith. When you look at Islam and you look at the very formal rigidity of Ramadan and fasting, how do you see that as literally the opposite in terms of being very, very rigid, daily 30 days, same type of very, very strict regulatory requirements about it. Like, how do you see something quite different? I mean, tradition-wise.
I think one of the things here is that certainly not just Christians, but the community generally here, that Ramadan is in a sense an identifying mark of Islam, isn't it? Really, if people think about Islam, Ramadan will come quickly to their minds. I think, yeah. I mean, I think, as I've said in my talk, I think we've lost quite a lot. As far as communion, fasting before communion is concerned, part of it may be the fact that, of course, communion was always early in the morning. Now it can happen in the afternoon, the evening, when that rule is just not easy to implement.
Sorry, just because there's some medical practitioners, and as a person who works in the NHS, we always send out, for our staff members just before Ramadan, and I'm also co-chair of the network, so so that staff are aware for their Muslim colleagues. But what happens if for example, somebody is diabetic and they need to take certain medications? Does it fall within allowed and non-allowed aspects of?
Yes. Yeah. You're not supposed to harm yourself through fasting. So anything that you should try your best in whatever way you can. But if there's any risk to your health, then you're not supposed to fast.
Then
right?
you're not supposed to fast. Okay, so
you said Christians fast for 40 days, right? David?
Yes.
Yeah, so, but do you drink or eat? Sorry?
Jesus did.
Oh, Jesus did.
Jesus
Okay.
did, yes.
Yeah, so what I'm asking is that, like, do you do the same like we do? Like, you don't drink at all, and to the
We don't have that sort of tradition. No, we don't.
Oh,
no.
okay.
I mean, Jesus fasted 40 days in the wilderness,
In
and Lent then followed. And what happened was that that not all food was given up. People would not, in the monasteries, for example, people would not eat until a certain time in the day. No meat, fish on Fridays. But certainly there is nothing comparable to Ramadan in the Christian faith. I think we need to make that clear. That may be a loss for us, but we certainly don't have it.
Last question.
Varsha, I'm intrigued by your Jainism. Now, I have a lot of Hindu friends, and they'll talk about Krishna. He's the superior god. Right? And to just say in short nutshell, Christianity, Bible belongs to the Christianity. Torah belongs to the Jewish people. Quran belongs to the Muslim people. We all have certain books associated. So which book do you believe in? Which book did Krishna talk about that you should follow? That we understand that Christ, the disciples wrote it, and it's focused on biblical. Prophet came, did this thing, and Moses is the book of Torah. So which is your book? Which is
okay? So in the Hindu tradition, because there are multiple paths into Hinduism, it's a very pluralistic religion. So when you say Krishna, then the Gita is kind of what Krishna and Arjun, that's a conversation between the two of them. Some of them, if they believe in Rama, they would do Ramayana. And if you are Shiva, the Vedas or so across India, people will follow different traditions. For us, again, we have certain texts, so we have agams. Because if you remember, a lot of this slokas or whatever were said, their tradition was to say it orally. In the monasteries, the monks would learn, and it was an oral tradition. And a lot of it is written about 500, 600 years after Mahavira. So, within that time, it would have changed. It's not really Mahavira's words, and then commentaries are written. So, because when a religion is 4,000 years or whatever, different aspects of it are illuminated in different books.
But would it be true to say that while in Christianity, the Bible, in Islam, the Quran, and for Jews, the Torah, certainly, have a very central authority, the holy books in Hinduism and Jainism are very important, but don't have the same level of authority as they do in the three Western? Would that be true?
So there are certain common prayers. There are certain common
yeah.
prayers, but it's not one book.
Yes. No, I'm not asking that. I'm asking if the authority is not so great of the ancient and wonderful books of the Hindu and Buddhist faith that they are the holy books in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism have. It's just a different way. It's a different approach.
It's different. So we have the Akcharanga Sutra, the Tattvat Sutra, Kalpa Sutra. So they are different books with different aspects, but not one is important than the other. So we have multiple texts.
But not one book.
But no one book.
Oh, how many would you say texts you have? 20, 30, 50?
So some traditions have 98. The others have smaller number because there was a break. So when Mahavira was there, after 400 years, there was a major famine in India. And initially these monks were, they called them Nigant. So they would not wear clothes and they were only men. But then the tradition broke that we had sky-clad and sky-clad people who didn't wear clothes and then white-robed. So the Swetambar tradition, I mean, there are two big splits. Digambaras, still you will find monks in India who don't wear clothes. Okay, even today. And the Swetambar tradition, which is much bigger, the monks and even the nuns, they have white robes. So, when you get different splits, then some texts stop somewhere and the others pick up something else. So the traditions are different, and then even more traditions. Krishna is Hindu. I know. The chronological order, so Sita is much earlier, Krishna is later, but if a tradition is 6,000, 7,000, I cannot give you chronological order who came when. Not that recent, even at least 3,000 years. Okay. So if you think about a land much bigger, there might be two different schools of thought going on at the same time, and they would coexist in the same place. I mean, with Jainism, because there've never been Jain kings or wars, you cannot say this king followed. So we know about the Buddhist kings, like Ashoka became, after a while, he became follower of Buddhism. Vikramaditya, when the calendar started, he was a Hindu king. So, this is why chronologically it's very difficult to put who was where. So Bihar is that land. So we know where our Jain monks were, where the main sites are. And if you think of Hinduism, if you think of Swaminarayan, now, then the Neasden Temple, the one in Kenton, the Swaminarayan movement is 250 or 270 years old. So Lord Swaminarayan came 270 years ago. Guru Nanak, he again was a reform movement in Punjab, and that is another about 600 years ago. So there have been different religions that have sprung up from the same land. But, each tradition exists side by side.
Could you tell us a little bit about the wonderful Jain temple in Potter's Bar?
Yeah, so we have a temple in Potter's Bar, and there's another temple on Kenton Road. It's much smaller, it's in a house, but this one is a purpose-built. I've brought a booklet here. Going off M25 near Potter's Bar. It's called Oshwal Center, if you Google it. So this place, when our community got it in 1979, it has 80 acres of land in a greenbelt area. And there were greyhound, like a dog's canals and all that. And there's a listed building which is still there. So the community acquired that property, and we used the halls for weddings as a community halls. But when they got this property, they had planning application to build a temple. The temple site itself is much smaller, but around it is a landscape garden. And we come from 52 villages near Jamnagar. So the Gujarat, so Porbandar and Jamnagar are both coastal cities quite close to each other. So we've planted 52 big trees around, the otlas in India. There's a kind of a space around a village where you have the main banyan tree and people sit around. So we've built that. And the temple has 3 major murtis. So I say 24 Tirthankaras. So we've got the last one, Mahavir Swami, which is a central one. Next to it is Parshvanath and Adinath. So we've got those 3. And then the 24 others are little kind of in a shape of a swastika built around that landscape. Really nice site. Anybody can go in. The temple is open weekends. You can, anybody can walk into the temple. You just need to take your shoes off. There is no restrictions. Built with sandstone. So outside it looks pink, and inside it's white marble. So if anybody wants to look, I've got a booklet here. Difficult to describe the traditional architecture, that is.
We have to end right now, but hopefully, if it's okay, everyone can come and ask you and talk to you afterwards, if that's okay.
Sure.
So we'll end there. Thank you both very, very much. Just a few announcements before we finish. Every Sunday we have tafsir. In the morning we have Soul Kitchen Food Bank, and we have Hussaini Madrasa at Noel High School. On Tuesdays we have yoga and ladies exercise classes. On Wednesdays we have Junjo Kai martial arts. On Thursdays Dua Kumal and Surah Yasin. On Fridays we have our Salam talks continuing. On Saturdays we have badminton for young people and women walking in the morning. And our Ramadan, and every Sunday we also have Sunday tuition classes. And Ramadan will be starting in a couple of weeks' time. So inshallah, look forward to seeing the program, which will be shared in due course. If you have any other questions, please talk to a member of the executive committee. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
You are, I'm not, I'm just laying here.
I think one of the most wonderful things I've seen so many wonderful things in India. Once I saw 2 Jain ladies walking down the street with a servant in front of them sweeping the road.
Yeah.
Well, why?
So it's like you don't step on something. So usually they carry, no, that's okay. They carry something so they don't step onto anything.
What about bacteria?
Yeah, you are going to. So what we believe is there are 5 senses. So 1 sense, 2 sense, 3 sense. So mammals and whatever are 5 senses, but you're going to do harm anyway, but try to do as less harm as possible. So.
So we can't avoid
No,
harming
no, no,
bacteria.
we can't.
I just listened to a deep conversation and I know I had to stop. Now, I just want to ask, how many people I know there are records of people that convert to Christianity, they convert to Islam, and if you go the right time, you can convert to Judaism. You know, it might not be easy or whatever.
More difficult with Judaism.
Yeah, it's what I'm trying to say. It's more difficult. It's more the round tricky. How do people convert to Jainism, and who does? And what is the number of conversion?
So, again, we don't have a conversion route, but anybody can, if they want to become a Jain, they can adopt Jainism. So even today, the Japanese people, we've got centers in Italy, Rimini,